This is Dateline News and Conversation. I'm very happy and privileged to have on the show tonight John Helmer. Let me tell you a little bit about who this extraordinary man is. He is the longest continuously serving independent foreign journalist in Moscow. He's a lawyer. He has served on the staffs of President Jimmy Carter, the Greek Prime Minister, and the Australian Prime Minister. With advanced degrees from Harvard University, he's been a professor of political science, sociology, and journalism in the United States, the UK, and Australia. His website, which is fascinating, it's called Dances with Bears. It is the most widely read website in the business world focusing on Russia. He's the author of several books and many articles. I'm happy to welcome to the show tonight Mr. John Helmer. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Regis.
Well, you've got a fascinating background, and I really would like my viewers to learn some of that background. So when I have you on in the future, and I hope we can do that, commenting on so many things that you have expertise in, specifically just about everything about Russia. You've been here for many, many years. So let me begin by asking you a little bit about your background. You're born and raised in Australia. A little bit about your family and a little bit about life there. And then when and why and how did you leave Australia?
Well, thank you for the introduction, Regis. I come from a generation of immigrants to Australia. My father was Polish. My mother's family came from Russia. My background was that I was educated in a Scots Presbyterian school, and then at university I was in a Scots Presbyterian college. As many of my generation, or as most of my generation, thought, Australian generation at the time, we thought that the real world began at the Empire headquarters, which was then England or Britain. And most of my classmates, the ones I was close to at least, went on to Oxford or Cambridge. I decided that the real world was in the began in the US Empire, and I thought it behoved me to understand the US Empire more than I had already studied the British Empire. In those days, we didn't even study Australian history. We studied British history. So I from graduating at the University of Melbourne, I went to Harvard. That's how I got to the United States in August 1967. So that's how I got to the United States, to the real world. Of course, I think Australia is rather different now, and I'm not sure how generationally minded Australians are, but that differs from the way we thought. Right now, Australians are far more Americanized than they were when I left in 1967. I spent most of my life outside of Australia, in the United States, in Russia, in Greece, in England, in France, and in Asia. I served in Sri Lanka for a time as that country broke free of its British imperial parliamentary system and turned into an American presidential one. I also served for a while in the office of the Secretary General of the Arab League when it had moved from Cairo to Tunis after the hapless Camp David Accords eliminated or expelled Egypt from the leadership of the Arab League at the time. How's that for a start?
Well, that's fascinating. Now I have to dig a little bit deeper, if you don't mind. As an old journalism teacher back in the 70s, I want to know who, what, how, why, when, and where. So the first question is, look, you have served in very high places in different countries. I mentioned in the introduction, you served on the staffs of President Jimmy Carter, the Prime Minister of Greece. You mentioned you lived in Greece, and the Prime Minister of Australia. Now, what catapulted you from advanced degrees in Harvard University to these very high positions in government?
That's a career of political losers, Regis. Each one of those countries has subsequently been destroyed. Not that I contributed to the destruction. It's been a grief of mine and a loss of mine that each of those countries has suffered serious intellectual, political, economic destruction in my lifetime. How did I go from one to the other? Well, from the beginning, when I finished my PhD at Harvard, was on the US Army in Vietnam. And I wanted to understand the way in which the battlefield experience, the experience of the war from roughly 1968 to 1972, which was the period I covered, and the men I selected for my PhD sampling as a political sociology were all white, and all, or as many as I could recruit, from the South Boston area, so that their backgrounds were roughly common and constant. And I was focused on why it was, what had happened to them during their war experience that caused three different outcomes. The first was heroin addiction on their return home. The second was their engagement in political activism in Vietnam veterans against the war and other forms of anti-war movement in the United States in the early 1970s. And the third group was, on the surface, relatively normal. Pro-war, patriotic, belonged to the American Legion and other veterans organizations, and showed neither psychological damage of the heroin or other kinds, and showed no opposition to the war, no disappointment, no alienation, no resistance, no anger at why they were sent and what happened. That PhD turned into a book, and I'm trying to remember what it was because it was over 50 years ago. Bringing Home the War, it was called, Bringing Home the War, American Soldier in Vietnam and After. As I finished that, I was asked by an old colleague who was on the staff of then candidate Prime Minister, then opposition leader, Gough Whitlam, would I come back to Australia and join a staff he was forming around Whitlam called the Priorities Review Staff, PRS. And that staff he was designing, and Whitlam had intended to assist and protect the Prime Minister from the major bureaucratic forces of a very conservative Australian government bureaucracy, which would serve the Prime Minister's desire to reform Australian society, create a different way of budgeting government money, and a new way of measuring and responding to Australian people's hopes that the Australian Labor Party, as it was then, led by Gough Whitlam, would remake the country. It had been not since 1949 that the Australian Labor Party had won an election and ruled Australia. It had, over that period, become, firmly part of the U.S. empire, firmly part of the U.S. empire fighting the war against the Vietnamese in Vietnam, and so on. So I joined that staff, and to protect myself from the, let's say, the ill fortune of politics, I took a university professorship or lectureship at the time at the University of Melbourne. So that's how I began from Harvard to Australia. And as I said, the rest is a career of working for political losers. Whitlam was toppled in a constitutional coup assisted by the CIA in November 1975. So it's a 50th anniversary of that event, those circumstances, last month, November 2025. Because of my experience, I went on to work with US colleagues in understanding how the staff around a president of the United States or a head of government in England or in the UK, as described, Australia, and then the United States, how it works. And I joined the campaign of Jimmy Carter in 1976 in what Carter was calling, in a slogan and a campaign slogan, the end of the imperial presidency. Carter was committed to reorganizing the way in which the presidency made US government policy, budget policy, regulatory policy, and so on. And when he won the election of 76, I joined the transition staff and then the original White House staff that was to implement this reform of the US imperial presidency. That's how I joined the Carter administration. You can ask some questions about that, but there was another political loser, as you understand. And when the Democrats and Jimmy Carter lost the election that followed his first term, I was fortunate enough to have met Andreas Papandreou, the candidate prime minister running for office in Greece. And my wife, late wife, Claudia Wright, a journalist, became the Greek press correspondent in Washington. She was also the New Statesman correspondent of London newspaper, which was committed to reform and socialism in the UK and was anti-imperialist. Claudia and I were partners in every way, and so she became Greece's foreign correspondent as well as the UK's correspondent in Washington. I joined the Greek government, and that government lasted from 82 to 89. And I was unemployed again after Andreas was defeated, and that government and its aims and ambitions had been defeated, and so we went on. It's a long story. So from the defeats in Australia, the United States, and Greece, I moved on to the Soviet Union in 1989. And everybody understands that the Soviet Union collapsed in the following 2 years. So from one loss, political loss, to the next, that's how my life has been.
Well, I find that fascinating, John. You're obviously a survivor. One door closed, another door opened. And I want to pick up now 1989 when you came to Russia, but I have to
Yeah.
ask you, and I know you've written a book about this, why Russia?
Well, several reasons. One was that I had had a passing experience as a visitor to the Soviet Union from about 1985 on. I wasn't really interested in Soviet politics until about then. I'd more or less avoided it when I was studying at the university level. I knew very little about Russia, though my family had come from there. Half my family had come from there. But during the Papandreou government, as we faced the 1988-89 election period, I discussed with the Prime Minister the possibility that the Soviet leadership, then Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership, might be persuaded to visit Greece in good time before the Greek election, and that visit might assist in taking some of the many disappointments that Greek voters had in Papandreou, especially Greek women voters, and restore confidence, enough confidence for him to win the election of that year. We needed, therefore, to reduce the drift of voters away from Papandreou towards the Greek Communist Party, the KKE. And to assist us doing that, I argued to the Prime Minister we needed to go to Moscow and persuade the Soviet leadership that it would be a better bet for them to support Andreas for re-election than to support the KKE, whose votes would be enough to push him out of power, not enough to elect a KKE government, but rather to allow the Conservatives in Greece to win, then led by senior Mitsotakis. The Prime Minister agreed with me, and we set up a scheme for secretly my going to Moscow. And I did. The circumstance, but I told in the book, The Man Who Knows Too Much About Russia. What happened was that let's begin with a background point. The Soviet Union didn't take Greece seriously. It thought Andreas Papandreou was nothing but a stooge of the United States and weren't really willing to support his re-election. That was their view. And my job was to persuade them otherwise. And I, after an episode in which I was put out of, made unconscious by a truth drug they were using and brought back round, interrogated under truth drug. It was an experience that I don't recommend anyone have. My position was you don't need, you're wrong, you've miscalculated, you've misinterpreted the Greeks, and especially Papandreou, but I'm not asking you to support his re-election. I'm asking you to demonstrate that your support can make a significant difference in European resistance to the Reagan administration and the conservative drift in US policy at the time. And since the German election was coming up, I argued that Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, then the Soviet foreign minister, should understand that if they could assist in the re-election of Andreas Papandreou by diverting KKE votes, they could let the world know that in the German election, which counted much more. Germany obviously counted much more to the Soviet Union then and now. That a demonstration effect in the Greek election from Gorbachev would influence their bigger interest in the outcome of the German election. They were very surprised to have a person show up like me. They were persuaded that I was speaking for the Prime Minister of Greece. They were persuaded through a day and a half of conversations after I came out of my truth drug episode that it was a good argument. There was merit in the calculation politically, and they promised that there would be a visit. To cut a very long story short, there was no visit. At the very last minute, months later, Gorbachev pulled out, and Shevardnadze was substituted, but in circumstances which made no political benefit for Papandreou. The KKE had persuaded the Soviet ambassador in Greece to foil our plot, so to speak. And at the very last minute, the entire structure of our conversations and understandings and agreement were cancelled, and Papandreou lost the election. But I had acquired an interest in Moscow in January, in the coldest part of the year, and I thought that after the defeat in Greece and after the end of my time in that country, I should give it a try to set up an independent media office, originally to represent the Greek papers in Moscow. Unfortunately, my wife was dying then. It was a very grim year. My sister had been killed the year before. My wife was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Everything was falling down in my personal life, and I had to go on to Moscow alone. And because of the defeat of Papandreou, I was persona non grata in Greece, and the Greek papers didn't want me to represent them in the Soviet Union. So I had to go on alone, very alone, in very difficult circumstances from 1989 on. So that's how I first came. That's why I first came to Russia with accreditation in 1989.
John, it's fascinating. You're right there in the world of political intrigue. I have to, you just went over it quickly. What was this about a truth drug?
Oh, well, it bears very short retelling because a person like me is usually accused of telling lies, propaganda all the time. What happened was simply that, what was happening was that I was in a hotel room, and a nice one. And I was expecting the emissaries of the Politburo to show up, and they did at the junior level. And the suggestion was we have drinks and toasts. I began then, as I've always had the rule that in drinking with Russians, they can drink vodka, I'll drink champagne. The effect is a bit slower on me than vodka, and I don't wish to compete against experienced vodka drinkers like the Russians. So my drink was spiked, and that was how it was administered. I subsequently learned from the KGB man who oversaw the operation. I later learned that there was a doctor outside my hotel room in case I succumbed in some way to the drug. Instead, what I thought was happening was I fell asleep. The gentleman visiting me exited the room, and I subsequently woke up alone. I thought they had left a bra on the bed, and I was persuaded to think, because I had no memory of falling asleep. I had a perfect memory of the drinking that had preceded the sleep, that it was made to think that I'd been visited by a lady. Well, I hadn't, but the wake up evidence they wanted me to have was that there'd been an innocent falling asleep after a drinking session, after an erotic encounter. Well, that wasn't what had happened. What had happened, I later learned, was they had administered a drug. And under that influence of that drug, I was questioned, both as to the code words that Prime Minister and I had worked out to convince the other side that I was, in fact, representing him and speaking for him in a context that was deniable should it have leaked out. Because later, much, much later, that drug was used in a Moscow cinema rescue operation after terrorists had captured the theater and held the audience hostage. And a version of that drug was pumped into the cinema. Unfortunately, it was a concentration that killed the audience as well as the terrorists. It didn't stun anybody. It wasn't possible to revive them. So the drug was potentially much more dangerous than I understood. But the operation, the security operation involved in testing me, did understand that there was a danger, and that's why the doctor was there to revive me. Now, I've often thought, what if I'd croaked at that time? What would have happened? Would have been the end of my career, of course. My wife was dying. I was dead. That left my children orphaned. It would have been a short career, which would have ended in a mystery, because what would have happened would have been that the Greek government would deny having anything to do with me. And I'd have been shipped back to my home in Washington, D.C., possibly buried there. So I was fortunate enough that the drug didn't cause me to succumb quite the way it did, so sadly, much later. But there you are. I survived.
Amazing. And you wrote a book, The Man Who Knew Too Much. This is about your coming to Russia and the stories that you just told. Am I right?
That's right. The Man Who Knew Too Much About Russia is not only about that attempt to use the truth drug that might have killed me, but it goes through the years of destruction of Russia that followed. And in 2009, I was the target of an assassination attempt, which really would have killed me quite dead, organized by a Russian oligarch. And what to say about that? The story's very old now. It's 20, how many years? Not since 2009, December 2009. The assassination attempt was foiled by my then wife, Tatiana Turitsina, who has also died since then. And we had been given a warning that something was afoot. We took the warning to the security services, and subsequently, while they did apparently nothing, one of three gunmen showed up at the front door. One morning, my wife, Tatiana, recognized immediately that they weren't what they said they were. Subsequently, they came back a few days later. I saw them in their car outside our apartment building where I had my office. Understood that whatever was happening was potentially lethal and least dangerous. Called Tanya to return. We called the police. The police showed up within 3 minutes, heavily armed, took us into safe custody at the police station a few minutes away from where I am in Moscow. I had taken a picture of the car's number plate. The alert Moscow police caught the 3 gunmen in their car, caught them with their guns, with a map of my building and an ambush plan for me, and a report they had prepared for the oligarch on my movements. They'd been casing the building, my movements. They'd interviewed neighbors. They had done quite a job to prepare to kill me. And we survived because the Moscow police were so quick, so efficient, and I have to underline it, so very honest. In the outcome of that affair, I learned the Australian government, the Australian ambassador to Moscow, a woman named Margaret Toomey, her superiors in Canberra, all were complicit in the attempt by the Russian oligarch, a heavy investor in aluminium or bauxite production and alumina in Australia. The Australian officials were complicit in the operation to remove me and then to cover up what had been attempted and foiled. The US Embassy attempted to help me. The Australian government and the Australian Embassy were quite satisfied. If I were to die, the blood spatter shouldn't come on their shoes. And I've learned that subsequently from the release from Freedom of Information Act request of the documents of the event. So I learned a lot about the Australian government's treason against its own citizens and the readiness of the US Embassy in Moscow at the time to protect its own citizens, as I was. I was a dual citizen at the time. Not a pleasant experience, but an instructive one.
I'm sitting on the edge of my chair. I guess I can get it from your website. That's a fascinating story. So you answered a question already that I was going to ask you. You do have Russian citizenship?
No, not Russian citizenship. Tanya was a Russian citizen. She died in July 2023, 2 years ago.
So
no, I have U.S. citizen. Sorry?
What's your legal status after all these years in Russia?
Well, I was banned. I've been banned. I've been PNG. I was declared persona non grata by an operation of the oligarch who, having failed to kill me, proceeded to persuade the foreign ministry, then under the present foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, to deny me renewal of my accreditation and then to ban me. But no, I'm a US, my legal status in Russia turned out to be a security risk. I was expelled on the ground that I was a risk to Russian security. And my wife, Tanya, in trying to investigate why and why it had happened, who was responsible, and how it might be changed and overturned, understood that that the operation to expel me had come from the oligarchs through the foreign ministry. The security services had not ruled that I was a security risk. The Federal Migration Service did not agree to ban me. And the years have gone by with that same lineup. The foreign ministry excludes me. And they did so again. And I've told that story in a later book. When Tanya died and I was forbidden, I had applied to Minister Lavrov to allow me to return with my wife's body to bury her in her home village in the Tomsk region, the southeastern Siberia. Lavrov said no. He refused to allow me to go home with my dead wife. That's what happened. However, I've gone on functioning in Moscow. If you don't mind, I won't explain exactly how, but credibly, while I remained a Moscow correspondent, the continuity hasn't been interrupted. My life's been severely damaged by what happened, but not my work. Without my wife, I keep working. That's all there is to do.
So you've been reporting now as an independent foreign journalist in Moscow for all of these years.
Yep.
Is it you alone? Do you have people who work for you?
Yes, I mean, Reggie, I'm not so unusual. Might have been an unusual story I've just told, but of course, there are people who work with me, colleagues and collaborators. Of course, there are sources that I continue to have. Those of your audience who doubt my word can read and then look into and investigate the truthfulness or the non-truthfulness, if that's what they want to conclude, of the material. Yes, I run a normal, old-fashioned journalism operation. Yes, that's what I do. I might tell you that from the beginning almost, there's no support, collegial support, solidarity, comradeship from the Foreign Press Corps in Moscow, and that's entirely gone now that Russia's at war, and that the European and US governments and all of their mass media are at war with Russia. So I've been an outcast or a pariah. There used to be, my colleagues then were Mark Ames and Matt Taibbi. Matt Taibbi's rather well known these days in the US media. They used to run a local giveaway newspaper called The Exile, and every half year they would have a competition for the worst Western journalist in Moscow, which was a way of holding to accountability the performance of major media like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and so on. And in this competition every year, it was very nice of Mark Ames and Matt Taibbi to disqualify me in the first round. So I was disqualified in the competition to be the worst journalist, Western journalist in Moscow for several years in a row. When the assassination attempt happened, not one of those US, British colleagues attempted to even investigate what had happened. They were all either frightened off, their proprietors, by libel warnings from the lawyers engaged by the Russian oligarch, or they thought I had it coming, or they thought I had to be lying. I received no solidarity or support from Russian journalism colleagues at the time. It was a salutary warning about how lonely a job at journalism can be. It was then, it still is.
So, John, I have to ask you, do you publish a newspaper? I mean, you go back a long way before internet.
Yes.
We're publishing. How are you publishing?
Oh, well, as an independent bureau, the bills had to be paid by as many contracts as I could form with as many media as I could recruit with interests in my covering Russia. In the first few years, that was political. Obviously, everyone was interested in Boris Yeltsin and the anti-communist revolution, so to speak, in Russia. But the world got tired quickly of Yeltsin, and I switched from political coverage to business coverage. Money tends to tell the truth quicker and more precisely about the politics and economy of a country like Russia, of everywhere. Money talks more precisely and accurately than politicians. And so I became the specialist on various sectors of Russian business, which dominate the world: diamonds, gold, platinum, mining of nickel and other minerals, coal. So I became the mining correspondent for mining specialist media in Canada and the UK and elsewhere. I became the shipping correspondent for media in Singapore and London, where shipping media are established. I became the insurance correspondent for the developing insurance industry of Russia, and so forth and so on. Those are the media that paid the bills for many years.
So, is that how you're paying the rent now? By submitting articles to these various media around the world?
Those days I was their accredited correspondent, and so I'd file stories on diamonds, on shipping, on the meat trade from Ireland, even every day. Those sort of specialist media tend to be interested in price movements. If you're talking to the industry, you're talking to people who have to make daily decisions to buy, to sell, to ship, and so on. And they need to know what the price is for something. They also want to know why price is changing and how price is changing. Mining's a different story. I came to Canada principally as the Russia business correspondent for the Globe and Mail in Toronto. At that time, a little person called Chrystia Freeland was the foreign news editor at Globe and Mail, and her view about Russia is subsequently very well known. And I used to have to listen to her screaming at me on the other end of the telephone because she disagreed with the evidence and the stories I was filing. But that's another story. The way it worked then was every year or so I'd have to renegotiate my contracts with the media that supported my office. They had regional spread, so I've mentioned some of them: Singapore, Thailand, a little bit in Hong Kong and Shanghai, London, the US, mainly New York. I'm leaving countries out, but basically the concentration became South African. So I became the African correspondent, the first African correspondent in Russia, because South Africa was so intimately tied economically to Russian gold, diamonds, and platinum, and mining. South African mining entrepreneurs are both more honest than Australian ones. I won't characterize Canadians for this program, but mining is a very interesting adventure story, and it has a very dedicated audience that knows when you're padding the story or failing the story or promoting a stock, as the Financial Times, all the financial papers are read by people in business to be lying their heads off, but telling that the truth is, well, what you can detect underneath the surface of the story. Well, my job was to to try to excavate in a mining sense the truth of the story for readers who already knew much more about the story than me. And so that's how I paid the bills on an annual or semi-annual or other contracts, and it made for a rather nervous Christmas time every year.
Yeah. Is that still the focus of your reporting?
No, because sadly we're at war. We've been at war really since the putsch in Kiev of 2014, and the civil war began in the Ukraine, in the east of Ukraine, and the US moved to a policy with the European allies, with the NATO allies, as all our audience understands, as you understand, Regis. Since the war began, I've been obliged to move to covering the war. Why? Because all of the capital links, but all of the business links between Russia and the rest of the world have either been sabotaged or cut by the sanctions war, by economic warfare. So covering the impact of that war on Russia became a priority. As the business capital raising, listing of corporations, all of that were damaged and then destroyed, annihilated more or less. My focus on the Russian oligarchy, which had dominated the Russian economy since 1995, ended. I don't focus and don't investigate the oligarchs anymore because they're all sanctioned, and journalism shouldn't give aid and comfort to the enemy in a war situation, so I don't. So Dances with Bears as a website became more oriented to the war, more oriented to military matters, more oriented to security and strategy. And that's how I changed as the world around me changed. But I've tried to continue to investigate Russian economy in wartime, whether that's the production and drinking of wine, the cultivation of oysters, the Russian cheese industry, Russian classical music on the radio. All these topics seem to me to be interesting as a way of giving your audience, my audience, Canadian audience, the international audience, but mostly North American, English, German, French, the European audience, an understanding what Russia's really like, as distinct from what the propaganda warfare has made it appear to be. So, that's how it is.
That's been my fault since coming here in 2016, and again in 2018 and 2019, and then moving here. It's been 6 years now. My entire focus has been to try to show to whoever is listening, primarily in the United States, what Russia is really like, what the Russian people are like. Russian culture, Russian history. You mentioned wine, cheese, oysters. It's huge here in Crimea. Uh, I keep commenting, John, on every corner here in Yalta, there's a wine store, a liquor store, and that's all over the place. And the wines are fantastic. I've grown to love Crimean wines and cheese. We have a friend who says, "Oh, the Russians don't know how to make cheese." They're making cheese as good as I've ever had. And of course, oysters. We visited a couple of oyster farms. And it's really wonderful to see these industries either come back strong or begin anew. And I was happy to know that you're covering that. Have you been down here to Crimea?
No, I have been to Yalta. I have been in Crimea, but it was a very long time ago, very sadly, and I haven't for the circumstances I just explained. But yes, the stories of how the war or the sanctions war have revived traditional Russian industries, traditional manufacturing, traditional food and taste, culture. This is one of the positive aspects of the war, and at the same time, the total failure of the sanctions war implemented by the successive US governments, including the Trump administration, and the successive European governments. The plot, the plan goes back to the Bolshevik Revolution of destroying Russia in Europe. Earlier than that, has now come to, as your audience understands very well, a defeat on the battlefield, a massive defeat of everything the Western allies have thrown at Russia to destroy it. Internally in Russia, yes, one needs to understand the positives of the impact of economic warfare on the lives and culture and consumption habits and prospects for the future of Russian people. All of that I try to do in Dances with Bears, but Regis, we have a problem. Let's call it the pro-Russian audience in the United States is very small. It's been damaged by propaganda warfare for so many years. There's no anti-war movement in the United States any longer, as people of our generation understand it from the Vietnam War time, where my story began. Yes, there's a podcast audience of highly capable people, ex-CIA, ex-MI6, ex-US Army individuals who retain credibility for having fought against Russia for many years. I don't know why one gets to be credible in the podcast universe for having worked against Russia for so many years without revealing what they did. Still, the podcast audience for seeing common sense between the United States and Russia is very small. Maybe it's 500,000 people. That's all. 500,000 people. That's a very tiny group of podcast quality and truth-telling. And that's compared to the mass belief in most of the lies told about Russia to support the war making. And as we come to the total defeat of the Ukraine, the US and the European allies on the battlefield, that public conviction in the worst about Russia, the worst about the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and so on, that public conviction continues to support massive spending. massive spending by the Allies continues in new forms. And now, as the Germans run out of money to continue their war against their traditional war, their Hitler period war against Russia, they are now stealing, as everyone understands, they are now attempting to steal the Russian assets, the sovereign bank reserves that were frozen and then confiscated back in 2022. So the West is running out of money to run its war. President Trump has decided that if the war will continue because he can't make peace on terms that meet Russia's requirements, as well as the other sides, he will make money at that war by selling whatever the Europeans want to throw at the Russians for the future, and not only on the Ukrainian battlefield. So it's a dismal story, dismal, sad, murderous, all those things. I'm sad because the ability to tell the truth takes time and effort, and the audience that understands and learns is so small. There's no political party that amplifies that truth any longer in any of these states that I've been talking about. Yes, in a country like Greece, the public opinion is more favorable to favorable to Russia and hostile to the war than almost any other public in Europe. And yet it's ruled by Junior Mitsotakis and a regime so allied to the war effort that it gets away with all sorts of internal civil crimes against the Greek people connected to the war effort without any accountability. So we have the collapse of accountability, political accountability, in the United States, in Canada, and in Europe. This makes it much, much more difficult for a journalism of my kind to expand its audience, to persuade, to have influence. I've been in politics so long, I don't have a particular hope in politics, the politics of influence. Politics is politics, and it's an exchange of votes for power, and truth plays a rather small role in the politics of today when we're at war as we are. So it's best to be rather modest and clear about the small scale of truth telling and the truth listening audience that you, Regis, and I, and our colleagues and comrades and critics, to agree on many things, must deal with. I'm sorry to sound waffly and philosophical, but it underlies a fundamental modesty. Now, the hope, where's the hope in all this story? Well, the hope is in countries like India and in China and in Russia, the Troika. Russia, India, China present the rest of the world with an alternative to an empire that's collapsing in Europe, in North America, and elsewhere. That's hopeful, but I may not last long enough.
John, we're in the same boat as so many others that trying to tell the truth. You're isolated, ostracized, you're banned. They have the algorithms that pick up on certain words or your name, and then you're shadow banned. And so for me, like you, the hope is in the BRICS, but especially Russia, China, India. And I hope you'll come back with me in the future to talk about this more as it continues to rapidly evolve. But, what I really would like to explore with you on another occasion, you've been here since 1989. You saw the collapse. You saw the advent of one Vladimir Putin. And the last 25 years that he basically has steered the ship from rising from the ashes to what I consider a modern day miracle. Um, I try to tell that story to people, to friends of mine. I think it's so important to understand the character, the heart, and the soul of the Russian people to have survived all of that. And you know, John, we both know they're facing it again. The UK, the United States, the rest of Europe, for hundreds of years have been hell bent on balkanizing Russia, stealing its assets, its resources, and the beat goes on. Will it ever stop? We'll talk about, I hope, more in the future about the special military operation and the goals of that operation that have been clearly stated by Putin, Lavrov, and so many others. Uh, John, this has been a fascinating conversation. I have to give a shout out to our mutual friend, Dmitry Laskaris. I found you because of Dmitry. He came here to Crimea 3 years ago, and we were his guide and interpreters, and we became very close friends ever since. He's got over 100,000 viewers now in just a matter of the last few months. So I have to thank Dmitry for introducing you to me. And John, people like you and I, and I'm a survivor just like you are, there's no quit. There's no quit, and there's no getting down on our knees in front of the altar of the empire. John, thank you so much. And I hope you will come back and join me to help my audience, our audience, discover more about Russia and the Russian soul.
Thank you for having me, Regis. I salute you for this effort. And of course, Dmitry Laskaris' Reason to Resist is an important voice on many topics, not simply the war against Russia, but the genocide in Gaza, the destruction of Greece and Cyprus by its rulers and by its imperial commanders. Yes, the empire's big, and we've got a job to do. Our audience has got a job to do to understand what the future holds. And the future's in Russia, the future's in India. We've just seen an extraordinary display of Indian sovereignty, national sovereignty and pride as it put on a state visit for President Putin in Delhi. And we've seen something similar in China already this year. So, yes, the future is in the Troika. There are many Russians, certainly of the business and oligarch level, who really want an end to the war so they can go back to business as usual. And for business as usual, they mean pleasure as usual. And that's for them, that group of Russians want to return to their toys, their boats, their seaside villas in Italy, in France, in Colorado, the ski slopes of Colorado, the United States, and elsewhere. Yes, let's be clear that the hope we have, the hope we report to our audience for the future of Russia with India and China is not universally shared in Russia. There's a very strong faction that opposed the war to begin with, that wants business as usual. And they are the people who've exported trillions of dollars of capital to offshore to avoid Russian tax, to avoid the country that whose assets they took so cheaply or stole. Now, the miracle of Russia's revival, as you described it, Regis, and I entirely agree. The miracle of Russia revival is that it was capable of doing this at the same time as the leaders of the Russian economy, so to speak, the Russian oligarchs, the fifth column, were stripping the country of its capital and assets. Now, I can't think of a historical example of a recovery in conditions in which the leadership of the country was abandoning it at the same time, and yet it's happened. And that's the outcome that we have reached in the war to date. And that's the outcome for which the president and the foreign minister and the general staff deserve unique credit. Historically, they've pulled off an operation to revive the country in circumstances in which the banking system and the leadership of the economy were abandoning the country. That's unique. It's unique. So there's always a story of how Russia internally fights its battles to preserve the momentum of this recovery and make sure that the outcome of this war isn't a return to business as usual, as we've chronicled it since 1989, and then the disasters that came on with the Clinton administration, Sturge, Boris Yeltsin, and all those economic advisors he had, whose names are rather well known now, claiming credit for advising Yeltsin, claiming credit for advising Gorbachev, and never claiming responsibility for the 3 million men and women, Russians, who died prematurely because of the economic policies inflicted on the country. That's to count the human cost, and it was genocidal. It was genocidal. And those individuals, like Jeffrey Sachs, who claim credit and credibility now for switching their position, don't claim responsibility for what happened before in which they were engaged. That's only one name, but there are lots of them. So one needs to have gray hair and a long memory, or in your case, Regis, a long memory without the gray hair. Good for you. One needs to have memory in order to have hope for the future, doesn't one?